B'Shem Hashem Na'aseh v'Natzliach. My dear Chavrusa, Rabbi Matov asked me a wonderful question. There was a widow that didn't have a place, Almana didn't have a place to eat on Passover, but she was Ashkenazi. So the question that arises is that are Ashkenazim allowed to eat by Sephardim on Pesach, on Passover? Because Ashkenazim, they have a stringency that they don't have KITNIYOT, legumes like rice and all the different types of beans. So Rav Ovadia deals with the Shaila on Yechav Da'at Chelek Hey Teshuvah Lev. I just want to say a disclaimer before I forget, because it happened in my house last year. Baruch Hashem, I have a Messiah from my Rebbe, HaRav Eliezer ben David. It was a Talmud of the Chazon Ish. He actually told my father that his friends would call him the bulldozer. He said, if Chas v'Shalom you say anybody wants to cause a rift and make like Sephardim or versus Ashkenazim, he says you put him in his place, because we need Mashiach. It's not enough, right? We can't be self-loathing Jews, self-hating. It's not enough that the whole world hates us, as you saw on every college campus and every protest around the world. We have to love each other. So Ashkenazim are like the left hand, we're like the right hand. It's all one thing. But I just want to say one thing, that definitely it would be forbidden if an Ashkenazi eats at a Sephardi house, that the Sephardi should offer him or let him eat KITNIYOT, because it's their tradition. But let's say the only problem here is that perhaps a lot of the food, the choresh and all that wonderful gondi and whatever, the rice, or the food that it is appropriate for Ashkenazim to eat, perhaps the previous Shabbos previous day was cooked kitnios in it, right? So, but definitely, the host should not. In Chelek Aleph, Rav Ovadia has a tshuva regarding this. That definitely, even if you're very, very Hamish and very lovingly, and you're Ashkenazi, you have an Ashkenazi grandfather or wife or in-law or like an honorary uncle, it would be not right if they come over your house just because they're in your house. They could have KITNIYOT. That's not right. That's like Messiah biad of Avera. That's not appropriate. The question here is something totally different. We're presuming here that the Ashkenazi is eating totally food that doesn't have any KITNIYOS in it, but it may be cooked in pots and pans that had KITNIYOT. Is that a problem? So let's go to the source of the halacha. The Gemara, the Talmud in Pesachim Lamed Hey clearly says the only chametz. What's the definition of chametz? Fermented 5 grains. Only 5 things can become chametz: wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. And actually, Rav Ovadia brings that if you look in towards the end of the Gemara, the Masechtas Pesachim Daf Kuf Yud Daled, you find many of the great rabbis, the Amoraim, would have rice and would have all the different legumes. So it's very clear in the Rambam, in chapter 5 of Hilchas Matzah, that the Rambam says any type of legumes, every type of KITNIYOT, like rice and millet and all the different types of beans and peas, it is impossible for them to ever become leavened bread. Bread can only be by halachic and this is, by the way, I want to just clarify, because Rav Ovadia wants to say, this is unanimous. Both Sephardi, Ashkenazi, the Rosh, the Trumas Hadesh, and every rabbi in the world agrees to this, right? This is not the point of concern. Everybody agrees that rice and legumes are impossible forever to become chametz, even if you make bread out of it, even if it rises, even if it... The same way potatoes can't be chametz, right? Everything we eat nowadays. You see that Baruch Hashem in the market, there's... everything is kosher la Pesach. Pancakes, bagels, all of it is made out of potato starch. How could that be? So Ashkenazim would agree to the Sephardim, as every single Talmudic rabbi had the custom of eating KITNIYOT in Talmudic times, as you see in KITNIYOT Dalet in the Gemara there. So there is no dispute between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. That's why, by the way, the Shulchan Aruch in chapter 453 says that the unanimous custom of all Jews, all the Eastern Jews, Middle Eastern and from Spain, is that they have KITNIYOT. Although Moroccans, some Sephardim don't eat certain types of legumes, but like Moroccans have more of an Ashkenazi type of custom, but all the other type of Tunisian and Persian and Iraqi and all the other Middle Eastern Jews and Spanish Jews would eat it. Now, where does the source of KITNIYOT come from? Rav Ovadia brings that the first source we have is from the Hagot Maimonides that quotes one of the Balei Tosfos, Rav Yitzchak Mikurbil, in the Smak. In Siman Resh Kafbet, the Samak says over there, some Jews have a custom not to eat legumes, rice and beans and peas and things like that. And the reason is, he says, even though this custom, he says, the first rabbi that started this custom was Rabbi Shemuel Mi'ivrai. He says, even the Balei Tosfos, by the way, Rabbi Yechiel, which wasn't a Balei Tosfos, would eat KITNIYOT. So these are the grandsons of Rashi, the students of Rashi, Rabbeinu Yechiel mi Paris, and the Ramak even concedes that you have to understand, even in the time, Middle Ages, you had Balei Tosfos and Shar Gedolim, not only Rabbeinu Yechiel. He says Rabbeinu Yechiel and many other Ashkenazi colleagues of his Balei Tosfos would eat KITNIYOT. But he says, the bottom line is, and he says something very clear, that unfortunately, I just want to also say a disclaimer here, just to make a broader picture, because people get ignorance is bliss. My Rebbe, Reb Tzvi, always says. My sister-in-law told me something, that a lot of people in the modern Orthodox community, or people that are traditional, they become lax even on eating chametz, or things that are not OUP, because one always has to know, Baruch Hashem, for 1 year when I was learning in the Mir, I would go to Rav Ovadia Shir every Saturday night in the Yazdim. And this is a very important thing, why essentially you can never become a Talmid Chacham. Shulchan Aruch was only meant to be learned with the Bet Yosef, and to know the source of halacha. Any halacha would come into 3 categories, and this is very appropriate for this year. Any halacha you learn, if you want to be a learned Jew, a Talmid Chacham Jew, you have to put in your, right when you hear the halacha, you have to classify this halacha into one of 3 different categories. Is it from Torah law? Because if it's from Torah law, then you safek daraisa l'chumra, right? If you're in doubt, you have to be stringent. Is it rabbinic? Because if it's rabbinic, then when in doubt, we go lenient. And that there's a 3rd category, which is KITNIYOT, and Rav Ovadia would always say this in his shiurim, which is, it's a minhag, it's some type of midat, it's above the law, and they explain over here that where did this custom come from? So it's very interesting to know that even the Samak says, he says even babies know, Tinokot Shabbat Beis Rabban, preschoolers know, that chametz can only come, biblical, halakhic chametz only comes from the 5 species of grains, like barley and oats, and by the way, you're allowed to have chametz from these 5 also. People that have digestive problems like me, they could have spelt, and those 5 that we mentioned. But he says that the reason that the Ashkenazim developed this minhag was 2 reasons. He says, first of all, when they would make these beans into powder, like have you seen the powdered soups? They would look similar to wheat, and they would get. And he says sometimes the wholesalers would, the same people that would process wheat would have rice in the bazaar, like it would be like an open. If you ever been to the Shuk in Yerushalayim, and all the open marketplaces that exist around the Middle Eastern world, you see that there's an open sack of rice and an open sack of wheat, and maybe they're going to fall into each other, or especially when they're grinded up, they look the same, and maybe that's why, by the way, we Sfaradim, like rice, we have to check 3 times is our custom for this exact same problem. The Ashkenazis decided, in their infinite wisdom of their Gedolim, that they're not going to check their legumes and rice 3 times to make sure there's no mixture. They're going to all together forbid it. But that definitely, all of the Ashkenazic, and it's just fascinating because I'm a big fan of history to know that even the Balei Tosfos, many of them would have kitnios. So even after the time of Rashi, Rabbeinu Yochim Paris and the Smak says many of his colleagues would have kitniyot. So this whole kitniyot thing falls into that third category. It's not rabbinic. It's definitely not Torah. It becomes a custom that was on Midat. They were worried. And now Rabbeinu Yerucham, Rav Ovadia brings one of the great Rishonim that is always quoted in the Bet Yosef in Maran. He doesn't like the custom altogether. And I'll quote for you verbatim what Rabbeinu Yerucham writes. Rabbeinu Yerucham writes, those people that have a custom not to eat kitniyot, minhag shetut. It's a nonsensical minhag. He says only the people that do it for a chumrah. And I don't know why. Like the Rabbeinu Yerucham doesn't even, he says, it's not my custom, and Rabbeinu Yerucham was Ashkenazi, by the way. Rabbeinu Yerucham, no? I think he was Ashkenazi, if I'm not mistaken. He says, I don't know why they do that, but it's very clear that the Sephardic poskim the Sfaradim never had such a minhag, right? And it's brought down, Rav Ovadia brings a fascinating sefer here. The sefer Nahar Pakud, that when the Syrian Jews moved to Yerushalayim Ira Kodesh, everybody was having rice, even though, and it was a clear, common sense, like a given thing, that you are allowed to have rice. Now, even though the Chida, Geon Ozenu writes that Chida is the big Rebbe of the Moroccans, the Chida writes that even though there are some Sfardim that were very big Talmidei Chachamim and they had an extraordinary amount of fear of heaven, they also accepted this stringency. But we know for a fact that he says in his other book, Lev David, that he does admit that the majority, the vast majority of Sephardic Middle Eastern Jews that are descendants of the Spanish Jews or Edut HaMizrach have the custom to eat kitniyot. Now, the whole shir is based on this heter of the Ramah. The Ramah brings in that same siman that we quoted in Shulchan Aruch, Seif Bet, 453 in Shulchan Aruch Archaim, he says, let's say during Passover, by mistake, chas v'shalom, a piece of rice falls into a food of Ashkenazi. Does he have to throw it all away? Like, we have to throw away, because, chametz, even 1 in 1,000. So if you have one piece of chametz that falls into a, in the U.S. Navy carriers, it's a lot of times in the news because of the problem with Iran. They're saying a lot of aircraft carriers to the Middle East and all around the world. Aircraft carriers, they have pots that are the size of this room, So let's say it was a Jewish aircraft carrier and it was a chicken soup. Even if one minute piece of chametz falls into it, it all becomes chametz, and they have to throw it away. The Ramah clearly says this is not the case for kitniyot. So if a piece of rice falls into a food of Ashkenazi, he should take out the rice, but it's brought down in the name of the Elia Rabbah that you for sure don't need 60 as long as there's the majority of the food is non-kitniyot. It's nullified, So you don't need echad b'shishim. The Aliyah Rabbah holds like this, the Pri Chadash holds like this, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav holds like this, the Mishnah Berurah holds like this, the many other Gedolim, which other two Gedolim hold like this? The Chaya Adam also. The Mishnah Berurah and Chaya Adam all say that they even though there's a Trumas Hadeshan that argues, there's a Trumas Hadeshan that says just like when milk falls into meat or meat vice versa, you need 60 times. But the main achronim, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch of Al Klal Yisrael, I just was listening to a thing actually, a biography by Rabbi Lev Yancey about the Bala Charedim. So it was saying that the Chavetz Chaim was very into Sefer Charedim, and the Chavetz Chaim, when he was younger, before he became a Rosh Hashiva, and used to learn with Balabatim and Shuls, he used to learn Chaya Adam. So Chaya Adam was the minhag of Ashkenazim was like the Chaya Adam. It was like their Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It was the de facto halacha sefer. So both the Mishnah Berurah, which is definitely the final word in the yeshivish world, word in the yeshivish world, and the Chaya Adam, they both don't paskin like the Trumas Hadeshan. They paskin like the Aliyah Rabbah and the Pri Chadash and the Shulchan Aruch HaRav. That all you need is a majority. So as long as it's there 51%. So if there's a soup that, for example, even in a liquid, even if 49% legume soup fell into a chicken soup, as long as you have 51% chicken, you can eat the whole thing, right? You don't need shishim. So Rav Ovadia says, excuse me, if you have KITNIYOT itself that falls into the food, it's 49% KITNIYOT, the soup's got, there was like, let's say, these kosher hotels, so they had the Sephardic kitchen, the Ashknezi kitchen. It got a little bit, I tell you, the waiters, if they had okay, I don't want to say this on camera, but, you have a lot of Turks that make mistakes, and common sense isn't too common anymore. And they're not getting paid like PhDs to be that careful. So it's a nightmare how many times mistakes happen. So very simply, the Rav Ovadia says logic would dictate that if, let's say, a chicken soup, yesterday they cooked rice in it. The taste of rice is definitely going to be batal b'shishim. Even if, and we don't even pass like the truth, we pass like the Ramah. The minhag is like the Mishnah Berurah and the Chaya Adam says and the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, which is the Pesach for many Chabad and Hasidim, says that you're definitely going to have a majority flavor of the thing, because the taste of the rice or the legume soup or whatever, the beans or the peas that was engrossed and embedded into the walls is not going to be more than a majority. The only time it becomes usur, according to Ashkenazi, if the majority of the taste or the essence is the thing. So Rav Ovadia says that's why he says that, and for sure. Now he actually brings a fascinating thing. He says that in Yerushalayim, it's a very big problem nowadays with the organic eggs, the free range eggs. He says there was a thing in Yerushalayim where if there was a blood spot in an egg, they would, he said, Mikra din, as long as you throw away the blood spot, they would eat the rest of the egg. But he said there was a time, this is not the permanent minhag of Yerushalayim, but there was a time that the rabbis of Yerushalayim said that b'yamim hayem haya asur et kol habetza. They would say, no, if there's blood in it, not only do you throw away the blood spot, you have to throw away the whole egg. Now, let's say somebody scrambled this egg. Does the pot become treif? Or you boil these eggs and then you see, but you knew there was a blood spot in front of it, right? You poached the egg, right? He says, since Mikra Din, the Rabbeinu Yerushalayim said, since Mikra Din, you're allowed to just throw away the blood spot. Let's say you didn't follow the minhag, right? That these people had to throw away the whole egg. Would the pot become usur then? No. Same thing here. Rav Ovadia says and he says it's a mefurish Shuvas Radvaz. The Radbaz even has a bigger chiddush. Listen to this chiddush. He says, let's say in a city there was a shoichet that he became controversial because one or twice he had by mistake sold people things that seemed to be treif. So then what happened was there became a machlekes in the community. This shochet, the former people would not eat from his shchita, but then the other people would say, listen, one time he gave something treif to somebody, doesn't make him bad. 50 years, my grandfather was buying from him. So he says, let's say you are eating by that other guy. So this is a shochet that half of the community eats by him. The firmer half that says no. Since he did hanky-panky once or twice, he did not good. He says that it's a mefur shashal shuvas Ravaz, which is one of the most prominent of the poskim in the chuvas. He was a contemporary of Maran, the Bet Yosef. He's and I quote him verbatim. He says, he says, now let's say you want to borrow a pot from this neighbor that eats from this shochet shchita. The Radbaz says it's a suffix sveka, you're allowed to use this guy's pot, even though you don't hold of his shochet. He says, why? He says 3 reasons. He says, first of all, we have a chazaka, the Gemara in Chulin says, there's a chazaka that most of the time he does the appropriate shchita. Right? Rov Eitzel Shchita Bekimhim. It's a klal in Shas, in Poskim. Secondly, he holds the Radvaz, although I'm going to tell you in a second, Shulchan Aruch doesn't pass. The Radvaz holds against Maran that ta'amo is only midrabanan. The taste of something embedded in the thing, if it's not mamashoy, is only midrabanan. He says his third heter stam kelim lav b'nei diyamanhu, and he says there's a fourth reason that there's a rov. He says what the taste that's embedded, usually in food, is more than 60 times the taste that's embedded. Right? So he brings he says that we find that we're machmir, he says a very important klal. Afilu misha machmir l'sarich shishim kedei levatel kol hakli, even if you need 16, that's only if it's for sure isser. But this shochet, maybe 50 years he was being a shochet. Okay, a couple times recently he's been slacking up. But 99% of the time he's been right. It's only a suffix. Suffix isser, you don't need shishim to be, right? And this is mamish an isser of nevela. Right, that the shochet, the people were burnt out from him. They said, no, you're not good enough. The Radvaz still paskins that you're allowed to borrow that neighbor's pot. So Rav Ovadia says, even though halachically he brings 5 different reasons to be mata the Radvaz, one of the reasons we don't paskin, we hold, by the way, this is important to know, that we hold like the Rabbeinu Tam. It's also Tosfos in Chulin. We paskin that even if you only have a taste of something forbidden, like a taste of pig, even though the pig itself is not there, but it's just the taste because it's in the taste that is absorbed in the walls, that's still asur min haTorah. It's a machlekes rishonim. The Radbaz seems to, in this tshuva pascha, not like that, but we definitely, but even though you have 4 other heters the Radbaz brought, right? Shishim is only for Vada Yisrael, not for Saba, it's not Bnei Yomo. There's a chazaka that most of the shochtim. So he says, Rav Ovadia says, if the Radbaz was matter for kelim of mamish suffik treifa, that some people don't hold of this guy's shchita, he says still you're allowed to go borrow your friend's utensil. He says, last but not least, I was just looking at the tshuva. I was telling your father actually, Lazi, that one of the great Av Beistins, Rabbi Shmuel Kohen HaGadol, they would call him, the Zera Emet, which is over there. You can bring it. The Zera Emet in Chelek Gimel, it's actually a fascinating tshuva. He says in Italy, northern Italy, where he lived, Modena. He was the Rab of Modena. He was an Italian rabbi, the Zera Emet, in Modena. And he has a fascinating tshuva that it says, let's say there's a famine. So in Modena, in Italy, you had Ashknezi Jews that lived there, and Sephardic Jews. So he says, with the Ashkenazi Jews, because there's a famine, could I matter them to eat because there's nothing for them to really eat besides matzah. At least could they dip their matzah in a bean soup? Because it's a famine. So that, I wasn't able to go through the tshuva. But after he writes, he says, he has a whole dinner. I don't know the conclusion to that. That if in a time of famine, would the Ashkenazim allowed to be eat kitnios? That's the tshuva in the Zera Emet Chelek Gimel Teshuvah Memchet. But at the end of that tshuva, he says, for sure, the next year, if these Ashkenazi people had kitniot, because they were dying, it was like a famine, there was like no food, it was a very shortage of food. He writes in his tshuva, which I was able to see the end of the tshuva, they don't need to do any hagala. They could use the same next Pesach, come next Pesach, because even then I guess people had special kelim, the Passover pots, because they didn't want to go through the hassle of hagala. He says they don't need to do. But by the way, the Zera Emet is very famous because he was the first person that wrote a tshuva if you're allowed to get vaccination. Rav Asher Weiss, when he gave his shir about Corona, should you get vaccinated or not, the Zera Emet was the first one to say you should, even though it could potentially makes antibodies, it could make you a little bit sick. He's one of the Chosheva Achrayim in the great Geonim of Italy. He Mefurish says that Ashkenazim are allowed to eat at Sparta's house, even though perhaps the pot the previous day. First of all, we say Stam Kelim Einam B'nei Yemen. But he says the Chiddush of the Zera Emet is, even if the Ashkenazi knows, the morning your dear neighbor or grandson, because Sfaradim even at that time married Ashkenazim, or he says even if you know that it's B'nei Yomo, that morning in this pot that you're having chicken soup, they cook rice. He says even then it's mutter, because of the Ramah. The Ramah says even if Mamish thing writes KITNIYOT falls in the pot of the food, the thing doesn't become usher as long as you have, according to the El Yerabba and the Mishnah Berurah and all the Rav Achrayim, as long as you don't have 50, and as long as you have 51%, you have the majority is not KITNIYOS. So he says Kal V'chomer then. So he says that even though, he says clearly the minhag is like the Ramah. And just to finish off this year, Rav Ovadia quotes that there's one of the Achronim, his name was Rabbi Grossman, Rav Shlomo Zalman Grossman. He wrote a sefer called Pesach Keilchaso, Siddur Pesach Keilchaso. He quotes the Kaf HaChaim, which the Kaf HaChaim quotes the Zera Emet, that you have to wait et la'et. That this whole heter of Rav Ovadia is the Ashkenazi that wants to eat by his Sephardi neighbor or relative has to make sure that at least 24 hours have passed. But Rav Ovadia makes a correction. He says Mechila. Look at the Kaf HaChaim inside and the Zera Emet inside. This is being misquoted. He says it's wrong. The Kaf HaChaim also, which was the Mishnah Berurah of the Sephardim, is a very prestigious place. Like Rabbi Yaakov Chaim Sofer, he says that it's clear in the Zera Emet that even if you know in the morning KITNIYOT was cooked, and again now they emptied out the pot, now they're making chicken soup, it's okay for Ashkenazi to eat with the Sephardi, because the blios of such thing, it's even the Chatchila it's mutter. So to finish our shiur, you could have we want to create ahava va'achva v'shalom v'reus. We're all children of one father. Everybody Ashkenazim can eat at Sephardi's house. For sure, Sephardis can eat at Ashkenazi's house, although they're going to miss the I had an Ashkenazi friend actually who would say when you go to have the Persian rice, it smells like Gan Eden. The basmati rice with the tadig is something else. Maybe that's another reason we need to daven for Mashiach, that the Ashkenazim could go back to what Rabbi Yechiel MiParis and the Rabbeinu Yerucham had. But the Torah is all the way of Darachel. Rav Ovadia ends his shuvah to say Darachel Darchinom Shalom. The whole path of Torah is to bring us to Shalom, and everybody could have a wonderful, meaningful time together. And we hope everybody has a wonderful Pesach. Kol Tuv Sela.